My name's Mark Adams and welcome to episode 64 of Marksmess Podcast. Usually I'm here with my daughters Charlotte and Catherine, but now they're older, they have lots of other things to do other than podcast with their dad, and they're probably doing the same thing they do every night, trying to take over the world. So this lets me explore geeky things that interest me, and this time we have a special guest to explore Irish mythology. This is James McNally, better known to his friend as Jimbo. How are you doing, Jimbo? Welcome to the podcast.
Not so bad, Mark. Thanks for having me.
That's okay. Jimbo and I both work at UNESCO World Heritage Site, the Giant's Causeway, as tour guides. And we talk to visitors about the nature of the site, the geology, and of course the mythology around the Irish giant Finn McCool. And Finn McCool is what we will be looking at in this episode as an introduction to Irish mythology. J. Michael Straczynski said that the point of mythology is to point at the horizon and to point back at yourselves. This is who we are, this is where we come from, and this is where we are going. And to my shame, I don't really know that much about Irish mythology. See, I grew up with a lot of knowledge around Greek mythology from the movies of Ray Harryhausen. I spent years immersing myself in Norse mythology with Lee Kirby and their ilk, but beyond the simple version of the Finn McCool story that I tell at the Causeway, and there's something about swans, my Irish mythology is quite lacking. And this is why Jimbo is here. Terry Pratchett wrote that fantasy is an exercise bike for the mind, and it won't get you anywhere, but will make you stronger. So, Jimbo, where did you start with your Irish mythology exercise bike?
That's a great.
Do you like that as an introduction?
That's a good one. That's really good. I remember when I was a kid getting a little fairy tale book, which no longer exists. I don't think. I think I absolutely tore it to shreds. I read it that many times.
I thought you meant it didn't exist anywhere in publication. It just sort of vanished.
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't remember who wrote it or when it was written or even what it was called. But it was something that was a sort of hand-me-down from my grandfather, and it was sort of kids' versions of sort of tales from Irish mythology. There was a bit of there was some Cuchulainn in there. I don't think Finn McCool was in it. But definitely there was quite a bit of Cuchulainn, and then from there I've just sort of had a general interest. I should probably preface, just for your listeners, that I don't have any sort of academic qualifications in this. I've just sort of had a lifetime of being mad about it, in a sense.
There are podcasters out there listening to this, knowing fine rightly that what makes somebody an expert in something is knowing more than you do. So I am quite happy with you calling you an expert in this. Now, whether you can put that on your CV or not, I do not know.
Well, I might do. Cheers for that.
that is no problem. But what we're going to do is look at Finn McCool. Now, you and I tell this story countless times during the year on our tours. And I suppose the first thing we do is to tell the story that we tell. Do you want me to tell it? Because you're going to be doing a lot more talking than me in this.
I think I would love you to. Yes, go ahead.
That's okay.
I would like to hear your version.
My version. See how it comes up. My version is basically that Finn McCool was a jealous giant, and he could see from the top of Northern Ireland to Scotland, and he could see the Scottish giant Benandonner. Now, sometimes I add in about him throwing a lump of sod over to Finn McCool, depending if there are people there who know what the Isle of Man is, because that's how the Isle of Man got there, by throwing a lump of sod, missing Benandonner, landing in the Irish Sea. And we know it's happened that way, because if you look at a map, you'll see the Isle of Man there in the middle of the Irish Sea. You'll also see in the middle of Northern Ireland where Finn McCool took the soil out of, and that's called Lough Neagh, and they're about the same size, so you know I'm telling the truth. So Finn McCool wanted to go and beat up Benandonner, but he didn't have a boat, he didn't have a bridge, and he didn't like getting his feet wet. So he spent a few days carving the rocks that were around him into their iconic shape, laid them as a pathway or a causeway over to Scotland, got over to Scotland, climbed the cliff to get a better look at Benandonner, and suddenly realised when he looked over that Benandonner was 3 times his size. So he got scared, he scrambled down the cliff, ran back across the causeway to Northern Ireland. Benandonner spotted him from a distance. Finn McCool came off the causeway, went around the bay into his house, got into the house, closed the door, and his wife Una turned to him and said, "What have you been up to?" And he explained about Benandonner, the fight, and about being scared. And Una just said to him, "Would you stop being such a baby about this. In fact, if you're going to behave like a baby, you're going to dress like a baby. So Finn McCool got his baby clothes on. He even squeezed into the baby's cot just in time because there was a boom, boom, boom on the door. Ben and Donner was at the door. Una opened the door. Hello, Ben and Donner. Finn's not in at the moment, but would you like to come in for a wee cup of tea? And being a semi-polite giant, he came in, sat at the table, had his cup of tea, and when he'd finished, "Where's Finn McCool?" "Now, Ben and Donner, can you keep your voice down because the baby's trying to sleep," went Una. And of course, Finn McCool understood right there that's what he was meant to do. He started to cry like a baby, threw toys out of the cot, just to get Ben and Donner's attention. Ben and Donner stood up, he strode over to the cot, he peered in the cot, and he suddenly realised that he had made a huge mistake. Because in the cot wasn't a small baby or a medium baby, but a giant baby. And if the baby was that giant, how big would the father Finn McCool be? So Ben and Donner got scared, ran out of the house, around the coast, and across the causeway back to Scotland, breaking up the causeway as he went along. So that's the basic story that we tell. Yeah. How far back is that story? Now, to me, that sounds very Victorian.
Yeah, that's a great question. And the running theme of this conversation that you're going to hear throughout is I'm not sure or I don't know, and it's not because I've not read enough, and it's not because I don't know enough about mythology or the folk tales. It's just that I don't know, and in my research I've not been able to find a definitive when that story began. Probably get to it a bit later on. It's certainly the Finn McCool, as I like to call him, the Antrim Finn McCool, or the giant Finn McCool, much different from the Finn McCool we find in earlier Irish mythology. I always in my head like to hypothesize that you're exactly right on that it was probably an invention of the old Victorian guides at the causeway, using a few familiar names from Irish mythology. Finn, of course, it's notable Ben and Donner doesn't appear anywhere in Irish mythology. His name roughly translates to mean the Red Man. Ben and Donner, that's in Scots Gaelic. He's not a character that appears in any other Irish mythology. However, there is in Manx folklore or Manx mythology that's folklore pertaining to the Isle of Man. Finn McCool appears, and Finn McCool is a giant, the same giant that we hear about in the stories that we tell. And I do have, in my research for this, I only have a passing knowledge of Manx folklore.
Now, just slow down a bit. The listeners aren't used to people coming in this podcast to do research, okay? For those that are listening, that's what the girls do not do when they come on the podcast to talk about their geeky stuff. So just to let you know that. Thanks for doing some research, Jimbo.
This particular story is just to give you we could sort of get an idea of where our story begins. This particular story comes from a book of Manx folklore written in 1911 by a lady called Sophia Morrison, who was a folklorist. She collected folk tales, so I would assume if she wrote it in 1911, the story goes back a little bit further. But the Manx version of that isn't about the Giant's Causeway, it's about a rock off the southern coast of the Isle of Man called Chicken's Rock. The story is fairly similar, bar the beginning. Finn McCool decides to take himself off to the Isle of Man with his wife, who is unnamed, and he decides to set up shop there until a creature from Manx folklore finds him, a creature called a Bagain. And a Bagain in Manx folklore is a sort of ogre or troll. This Bagain, who is also unnamed, he's just called the Bagain. The Bagain decides to challenge Finn McCool. And Finn McCool says, well, I'm all for this. Come on, bring it on. And then the Bagain comes stumbling down the hill, and Finn sees how massive this Bagain is. And then his wife decides to disguise him as a baby, put him in a baby's crib. The Bagain sees the size of this baby that's meant to be Finn McCool's son and says, if this is the size of the baby, how big is the father? And off he runs back up the hills again. However, the Bagain does later come back, and the Bagain and Finn McCool end up having a big fight on the southern coast of the Isle of Man, near a place known today as Port Erin. The Bagain standing in the spot where that town is, Port Erin, is said to have carved out the bay there, and Finn McCool standing off the southern coast is said to have channeled out the channel between the Isle of Man and the Calf of Man, which is a smaller island off the southern coast of the Isle of Man. And Finn McCool was losing badly, so he decided to run away back to Ireland. And Bagain ripped out one of his teeth and threw it at Finn McCool, and the tooth hit the back of Finn McCool's head, bounced back and landed in the sea and became a rock known today as Chicken's Rock, which is a spiky rock that sits off the southern coast of the Isle of Man. And Finn McCool turned around and cursed the rock. And it said that that's why seamen or sailors have so much trouble around Chicken's Rock on the southern coast of the Isle of Man. So I found that remarkable how similar that is in a lot of ways. But in a roundabout way, to answer your question, I would certainly assume that story that we tell about Finn McCool is probably Victorian. And what's notable about it too is there's many different versions of it.
There are, because if you do come to the Giant's Causeway and you do get a tour by one of our award-winning tour guides, you will get different versions, and we will all embellish it in different ways. There's bits about rocks that were baked into buns and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Now, this has actually happened to me a couple of days ago on tour. Somebody said, what about, is it Finn McCool on the other side of Carlingford Rock? Down the south of Northern Ireland from the Mourne Mountains, you look across the bay there, and there's a shape of a giant. Now, have you heard that?
I've not heard that before. I've not heard that.
That was one of the things about Finn McCool we were told, because we would have caravan down at Cranfield, which is down near Kilkeel. And we were always told that if you look at those hills over there, you can see the shape of Finn McCool, who looked remarkably like hills. So it's that type of thing. And somebody actually came to me the other day and asked me about that.
Yeah. I've not heard that one. Certainly, I grew up with the story we tell. My mother talks about growing up with what we refer to as the maiden, the Scottish maiden tale.
Right, go for it.
Which is the tale of Finn McCool being in love with a Scottish maiden. Could see her from his house up in the chimney stacks, and he decided to build a bridge to Scotland to go and see her. So he came down from his house and built a causeway. He's in the middle of building this causeway, but then his mother, Granny McCool, comes and sits on top of the Stookens, the two big hills which sit to the west of the causeway, and she sees him and gets annoyed that he's going away and not going to be spending any time with her. So she's a powerful druid, as it were, and gathers a storm, and the storm causes Finn McCool to fall into the ocean, and then he has to abandon building his causeway. That causeway became the Little Causeway. The next time he came around and decided, I have to go out and see this lady, so he starts building a causeway again, and the same thing happens. Granny McCool gets up on the Stooken, calls out a big storm, Finn McCool falls off the causeway into the ocean, and he gives up, and that becomes the Middle Causeway. Then Finn McCool says, no, I'm going to give it my full effort here. So he came out and he built this causeway, and he built it as far out as he could, but Granny McCool called the biggest storm she could summon. And this storm was so powerful that it ended up killing Finn McCool, and he died. Well, that causeway built, by the way, would have been the Grand Causeway. So Finn McCool, he died, and Granny McCool looked down and realised what she'd done and was so overcome with grief that she turned to stone.
Folks, this is why I've got Jimbo on, because that's quite mesmerising. I've heard a version of that, but not as well said, because I didn't bring in the free causeways.
Yeah,
because that's quite good. I like that.
It's one that I've only been asked. Somebody asked me about it last year. I think I've only told it once on a tour, because it's not the most uplifting of stories.
It isn't. It's a wee bit romantic, but who likes to die at the end of a tale? Shakespeare. Oh, dear. So
in my sort of head canon, I like to think that story is maybe in line with a bit more about what maybe they would have told about the causeway before the Victorian age. But I mean, I'm not sure, and I don't know.
To put into perspective of human civilization in Ireland, the second oldest place in Ireland we've got evidence of humans is in Coleraine, which is about 20 miles away from the Giant's Causeway, up the river at Mount Sandal.
That's right. Yeah.
So they wouldn't have travelled through Ireland, which was a dense jungle at that time, oak trees especially. They would have come along the north coast from Scotland, and they would have passed the Giant's Causeway about 9,000 years ago. So what they would have thought of that, I don't know. I'm guessing they would have thought, oh, look, there's stones.
Well, they had a name for it, which is different from our name. They called it Clochan na Búmhairc, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. Roughly translated into English, that means the stepping stones of the Fomorians.
Who were the Fomorians?
So the Fomorians are beings, I guess you would call them in Irish mythology, who are generally evil. Not much is said about their origins. Fomorians, roughly translated into English, could mean people from the sea, or people from underground, or a lot of people like to think people from under the sea. And they're variously described as sea raiders, things like that, and they sort of come and make life difficult for a lot of the who are called the Tuatha De Danann, who are considered to be the pantheon of Irish gods. They're not explicitly stated as such. I'll talk about that a bit later, I'm sure. And a lot of what a lot of scholars think about the Fomorians and the Tuatha De Danann is that they sort of represent for what would have been the sort of early religion then, which is sometimes called the ancient Celtic religion, but at least early Irish religion. The Tuatha De Danann and the Fomorians were sort of hypothesized to represent the good forces of nature and the bad forces of nature. For example, from the Fomorian side, you have he's not called a god, but we have a chap called Balor of the Evil Eye, who
I've heard of him.
Yes,
and Slain McGruff comics. You would like that.
Oh yes, I've not seen that. Well, Balor of the Evil Eye lives on Tory Island, which is just north of Donegal. Tory Island is variously associated with the Fomorians quite a lot, and Balor has an eye that can basically cast a powerful beam of light that can burn or sear. And it's sort of thought that he could represent the sort of bad side of the sun. I wish I could think of a better word than that. The sort of evil side of the sun, causing wildfires, things like that, or sunburn, which sometimes I think about people back then, and I'm like, man, they didn't have sun cream or anything. And then you have versus the likes of Manan and MacLear, who is the Irish god of the sea. So the Fomorians are people that crop up from time to time that cause a lot of problems, and it's a theme that we see in a lot of mythology. Greek mythology, you have the Olympians and the Titans, or Norse mythology. Two names aren't coming to me right now, but you have a similar sort of aspect in Norse mythology as well. You have the good guys and the bad guys. Fomorians are the bad guys, and they appear out of nowhere in Irish mythology and then disappear as quickly as they came.
So back to Finn.
Yes.
Because I've no idea how we got there, but it was a good journey. Before the Victorians, what do we know?
To answer that question, I'll give you a sort of good rundown of Irish mythology about how it's sort of organised.
Yes, please.
Irish mythology is contained within what's known as cycles. I think before this you were asking me what I mean by cycle.
Yeah.
Cycle is basically a collection of stories concerning the same people or the same age. The cycles in Irish mythology are the mythological cycle, Ulster cycle, the FIONN cycle. That's where we find Finn McCool. And the fourth cycle is the King's cycle. To give a rundown of those mythological cycles, if I could. Again, as well, when we're talking about Irish mythology, a lot of what we do know about it was recorded by Christian scribes in the 8th century. The people before that were fairly proud, well, at least we can ascertain that they were fairly proud of their oral tradition. So they had a tradition of passing these stories down orally. These people that would have passed these stories down were called File, and they existed right up until about the 16th or 17th century. We would know that term now. We would probably more associate that term with bard. And without getting too bogged down into sort of early Irish society, File were very, very well respected people in society. They were roughly seen as the equivalent of kings. They often would sit at the same table with the king. There's even stories about File eating off the same plate as the king. They were so highly regarded. So these would have been the people that would have been passing these stories down. And then Christian scribes started writing them down in the 8th century, going well into the Middle Ages, which I find very interesting. This is paganism for an early Christian scribe. Why would they bother recording it? To me, they must have seen some value in it. Certainly, and there's a few different hypotheses around it. Some people say that they seen the cultural value, wanted to write it down, but said, well, we can't just write it down and keep it pagan, we'll Christianize it. Other people said that they wanted to write down the pagan versions, but the church said, no, you must Christianize these. Those hypotheses are sort of come about because we were able to infer quite a bit about the Irish religion from what those Christian scribes have written. So even though they did Christianize them to some extent, and we don't have them, we'll probably never have the original versions of these stories. Any of us who are into Irish mythology are very thankful that they wrote them down. And by Christianization, they basically what they did was for the mythological cycle, which is basically the tale of how the people of Ireland came to be. There's no sort of, we can go back and there's no sort of, as you get in a lot of mythologies, there's no sort of creation myth. Well, there may well have been. However, the Christian scribes start with Genesis. And then we get to Noah, and the people of Ireland are essentially descended from Noah.
Now, which of his three sons? Ham, Shem, or Japheth?
It's not in my head and I've not written it down. I think it's, you said Japheth was the second one.
Ham, Shem, and Japheth.
I think it's the third one, but I'm not entirely sure. But I believe it is the third one. I didn't think you would ask that, so I just put down descendant of Noah. But of course, yeah.
Listen, it is perfectly okay because those are things that we can now go and Google.
Yeah,
but that is amazing because I do know that other civilizations will start from that, and I'm wondering if that's a Christianization of that throughout the ages.
Yeah, they talk about there's sort of these 6 groups of people that come to Ireland, and the stories are, well, pretty funny sometimes, which is one of the things I love about Irish mythology and all mythology. Well, not all mythology, but a lot of mythology sort of, you have your gods, but they basically have the same emotions as people, which is one of the things I find most riveting about it, that you have this god with all these almighty powers, but he's can act like a big baby if he wants to. One of my favourites is at the very, very beginning of the mythological cycle of Irish mythology, and that concerns Kesser, who's described as a descendant of Noah, who to escape the deluge comes to Ireland on 3 ships. One ship is said to have all the men, one ship is said to have all the women, and the third ship, which she is on, has mostly women but 3 men. The other 2 ships fall into the sea, they get wrecked, so we only have the one ship left with Kesser on it. And so it has three men on it and 97 women. Now, the women get divided up among the men, but eventually, to cut a long story short, 2 of those men die. One of the men survives, Fintan. And Fintan, he can't handle all these women. It's the basic gist of the story. He can't handle it. He can't handle it, so he decides... because this is another thing about Irish mythology, people just tend to, just out of the blue, they shapeshift into some sort of animal, which is another thing. So even though his powers aren't described anywhere else beforehand, Fintan just magically shapeshifts into a salmon, and he jumps into a river and lives out his life as a salmon. Now, the people of Kesser eventually die off, but Fintan remains. Fintan is sort of a figure who comes in and out throughout Irish mythology because he's basically immortal. He comes back, he shapeshifts into different animals, and he is said to sort of guide a lot of the kings of Ireland who would be yet to come. Now, you sort of go through this. You have those, and then when we get to the sort of Tuatha De Danann, they come from another group of people, another descendant of Noah Nemid. They get there, and these people of Nemid find the Fomorians. They can't win against the Fomorians. The Fomorians are very tough for them, so they escape. One group of them goes to Britain and becomes the descendants of the ancient Celtic Britons. One group goes north, the other group goes to Greece. The ones that go to Greece become enslaved. Hundreds of years later, they come back to Ireland, and they're then known as the Fir Bolg, which means the men of bags. That's in reference to the bags that the Greeks used to make them carry. And they take over Ireland, they defeat the Fomorians. They're the ones that divide Ireland into provinces. But then, about 40 or 50 years later, the Tuatha De Danann come, and the Tuatha De Danann are essentially all-powerful beings. As I said, the sort of pantheon of Celtic gods, and they defeat the Fir Bolg, and a few different stories talk about them kicking the Fir Bolg out of Ireland, and some stories they go to Connacht. But the Tuatha De Danann then rule Ireland. Yes, so the Tuatha De Danann, probably one of the key points which I didn't mention, there's the Battle of Moytura, when the Tuatha De Danann defeat the Fir Bolg, and then the second battle of Moytura, they defeat the Fomorians. But then We have the Tuatha Dé Danann, but then the Milesians come. The Milesians are the people coming from Spain who are said to be the descendants of, or the ancestors of ancient of Gaels, of the people who live in Ireland now. And their king, the Milesian king, comes to Ireland to meet the Tuatha Dé Danann. Cut a long story short, again, somebody murders him. So to get revenge, the Milesians invade Ireland, defeat the Tuatha Dé Danann, and force them into the hills, into the fairy mounds. The Tuatha Dé Danann take over the other world. The Milesians take over the overworld and become what we know today as Irish people, the ancestors of Irish people. The Tuatha Dé Danann then become the fairies. Now, I went a bit off track there, but we have in the mythological cycle, we have the Ulster cycle as well. That's Cuchulainn.
No, you can't just go over.
We can't just go over
Cuchulainn. Like,
yeah, okay. Yeah.
Briefly, who is Cuchulainn?
True, Cuchulainn and Finn McCool, they have a lot of similarities. The difference between Cuchulainn and Finn McCool is Cuchulainn is essentially what we know as a demigod. Cuchulainn is basically a champion of Ulster. One of the sort of probably the most famous text or the most important text, whatever way you want to see it, is the Tain Cuchulainn, which means the cattle raid of Cooley. It's sort of seen as Ireland's answer to the Iliad. It's an epic. It goes into we'll sort of summarise it as good as I can. To summarise the Tain Cuchulainn, so a cattle raid, first of all, I always like to imagine it a little bit like cowboys in the Old West. Cattle were very, very important to the ancient people of Ireland. They were sort of seen as a sign of wealth and what seems to be a common occurrence. There's a few stories of cattle raids in Irish mythology is people would go from other kingdoms, or mercenaries would go into kingdoms and they would raid the cattle, they would steal people's cattle. Effectively, the equivalent of these days would be going and burgling somebody's house in the same sense. The cattle raid of Cooley describes how Queen Maeve of Connacht wants to come up and steal, to cut a long story short, because there's a lot which goes into exactly why Maeve comes up to steal this prize bull, but Maeve basically decides she's going to steal Ulster's prize bull. Right when she does so, she goes up to war with the people of Ulster, but the people of Ulster are struck down by a curse, Macca's curse, Macca of Ardmacca, which means the heights of Macca, which is the Irish name for the county Armagh, which me and you are both from, which has a Navan fort, of course. The men of Ulster are overcome with the pains of labour, as it's described. They're overcome with the pains of childbirth as revenge from Macca, so they cannot fight Queen Maeve. The only person that can is Cuchulainn, who is unaffected because of his demigod status. Okay. And he single-handedly in the Tain Cuchulainn defends Ulster from the people of Queen Maeve's armies. He's famous for what's known as just translated as his warp spasm, his sort of superpower, if you will.
that comes into Sliam McGruff, the 2000 AD character. He would have warp spasms.
Yes.
So maybe they're... I need to look into this. Pat Mills, who wrote Sliam, would have been really into his Irish mythology. Okay. You I must. Really interesting stuff. Bringing in a lot of Irish mythology. A lot of what you're talking about is, coming from that time and that period. Yeah. So that's the Ulster cycle?
The Ulster cycle, yeah. And the Ulster cycle sort of is mainly about Cuchulainn and his life going up to his death. And then there's a few other stories mixed in. The FIONN cycle concerns us with Finn McCool. We'll talk briefly about our last cycle and then we'll get stuck into Finn McCool. The King cycle is various stories about kings of Ireland, sometimes, according to historians, entirely fictional. Sometimes semi-fictional, sometimes ones that were completely real, like Brian Boru. So this is the King cycle has a lot of your tales of people like the Nile of 9 Hostages, Conn of the 100 Battles, people like that, up to Brian Boru. Now, I know I'm firing off names there.
Oh, no, it's okay.
Out of all of them, the King cycle is actually one I'm probably the least familiar with because it doesn't sort of follow a sort of narrative. Not that the rest of them sort of fall into neat narratives a lot of the times too, but the King cycle is fairly disjointed and it's hard to find. I've yet to actually find a collection that has all the King cycle stories on it, but maybe if one of your listeners knows. If we go back to the FIONN cycle, FIONN cycle is basically the story of Finn McCool and the story of what's known as the FIONN. We'll talk about the FIONN first. The FIONN were possibly historical, more than likely historical from what I've gleaned. The FIONN were essentially a group of young men. Most sort of people now believe them to be men who were born of the old Gaelic nobility, aristocrats. They were basically men who were due to inherit land but hadn't yet inherited it. So what they did was these men went off and joined this roving band of warriors known as FIONN. FIONN through the summer were expected to live by hunting, selling pelts, things like this. And then in the winter, they would normally take up residence with a king, sometimes the High King. A lot of the time in Finn McCool stories, it's they take up residence with the High King, who, in return for their protection and also entertainment as well, he sort of houses and feeds them all winter until they're ready to go back out again in the summer. And when I say entertainment was, well, what's interesting about the FIONN is not only were they expected to be very strong warriors, they were also expected to be able to recite poetry and write poetry as well. So this FIONN, the FIONN have a motto which gives you an idea what of who the FIONN were. So the FIONN, number 1, purity of our hearts. Number 2, strength of our limbs. Number 3, action to match our speech. It gives you an idea of who they were. In the mythology, they're seen as this roving band of warriors who goes about normally doing good.
it reminds me of what you would call Ronin, which are samurai without a master, or hedge knights.
Yes.
From Middle Ages, who are knights without king or baron or whatever.
It's believed that it comes from Proto-Indo-European culture. I'm not going to get bogged into Proto-Indo-European culture. That's sort of very, very intense stuff. But
we covered that in podcast 26.
Yeah. But yes, this sort of idea that you have these roving band of warriors in their youth, it's sort of seen as, these days, it maybe could have been a rite of passage for a lot of young men, not just in Ireland, but I'm sure all over the world. What to do with these young men who maybe if they stayed at home waiting to inherit their land, they might do bad deeds. So why not send them out into the woods so that they can learn a few lessons and then come back full of knowledge? Which is sort of, we see it today. Well, probably the closest approximation of it we have is when we're 18 or 19, we go off to university and try our best to live.
There's a lot of cultures that would do that, from Amish.
Yes, the Rumspringa.
Yeah, and even Native Americans going out and doing their first kill of buffalo or something like that.
Yes. So that's the sort of the gist of who the FIONN are. Who Finn McCool is? Well, in Irish mythology, or in the FIONN cycle at least, he's not a giant. There's not really any mention of him being a giant. And I'm sort of reminded of a quote from a chap I'm sure some of your listeners may have heard of, W.B. Yeats. Yeats has a great quote which sort of puts this in perspective. He said this in his book, Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry. He wrote in 1888. He said, "When the pagan gods of Ireland, the Tuatha Dé Danann, robbed of worship and offerings, grew smaller and smaller in the popular imagination until they turned into the fairies, the pagan heroes grew bigger and bigger until they turned into the giants." He wrote that in 1888. Sort of puts that in perspective a lot. Yeah. When we go back into the Irish mythology, Finn McCool is not a giant. Finn McCool is son of Cool. McCool, Mac, meaning son of. So Finn McCool. Finn, by the way, means fair, bright. So that's where we get the idea that Finn McCool had blonde hair. That was not his original name. His original name was Denny, which means little stag. Now, to sort of tell that story, you sort of have to go into the sort of origins of Finn McCool in mythology. Essentially, his father, Cool, he was once the leader of the FIONN. He defied a druid's wishes and he tried to marry the king's daughter, Myrna. He was killed by a member of the FIONN called Gol MacMorna, who would become Finn McCool's later rival, sort of, that's Finn's arch nemesis throughout the cycle. Myrna conceived a child being what we know as Finn. So under threat from the druid and from Gaul, she fled to Slieve Bloom. Slieve Bloom Mountains are in County Leitrim, County Offaly, very near a town called Ballyfin, which means town of Finn. It's sort of hypothesised this is the town we're talking about, Ballyfin. They go up to the mountain, Slieve Bloom, where she meets with her aunt called Beaumill. Beaumill and Myrna basically raise Finn McCool. Myrna is said to be able to run as swiftly as a deer, and she teaches this trick to Finn McCool. Beaumill is a lady who trained warriors, and she's the one who trains Finn McCool in fighting. So Gaul eventually catches up with Beaumil, and Myrna and Denny. And so they send Denny away with a group of bards. They're the ones that taught him storytelling and poetry, and they give him the nickname Finn, meaning fair or bright, on account of his blonde hair. So that's where we get to Finn McCool. When he was older, Finn McCool found a lady whose son had been killed by a warrior. Finn avenged the son, killed this warrior, and on the body of this warrior found his oxter bag. Now, the oxter bag is one of Finn McCool's many possessions that he has, and the oxter bag belonged to his father, and this warrior is said to have looted Finn McCool's father. Cool is said to have looted his corpse after he was slain and stolen this oxter bag. So the oxter bag is a bag which Finn McCool has made of stork skin that he can put his hand into and pull out anything he needs at that particular time, which is one of the things. Cool. Yeah, which is pretty neat. Finn McCool, also another famous, probably one of the more famous tales from Irish mythology that me and you would be familiar with is, of course, the Salmon of Knowledge.
Oh, yes.
Finn McCool, of course, associated with the Salmon of Knowledge too. After this, he goes to learn off a druid called Angus. This Angus character, he's a druid who has spent the last 7 years trying to catch the Salmon of Knowledge. The Salmon of Knowledge is a salmon which swims to the other world, or Tir na Nog, and eats berries from the Tree of Life. These berries give the salmon all the knowledge in the world. Angus wants to catch this salmon and eat it, and therefore gain this knowledge, and he spent the last 7 years doing so. Finn McCool decides, in return for the teachings this druid has given him, that he will look after this druid in his old age while he tries to catch this salmon. So Angus eventually catches the salmon. He gets Finn McCool to cook the salmon, but Finn McCool, as he's cooking the salmon, burns his thumb on it, and to cool his thumb down, he puts his thumb in his mouth and therefore tastes the salmon before Angus does. He brings the salmon to Angus. Angus eats a bit of it and realises immediately that he's not getting all the knowledge in the world. Somebody else tasted this salmon first. And Finn McCool told him what happened, and Angus said, well, to get all the knowledge in the world, to get whatever knowledge you desire, you will have to put your thumb in your mouth and taste your thumb. It's sometimes known as his thumb of knowledge, or sometimes you hear it called the tooth of wisdom. There's some stories where he has to place it on his tooth. But one of the things I love about that story is Angus doesn't really seem too bothered about that. After spending 7 years trying to acquire all the knowledge in the world, he's just like, oh, okay. Okay, so fair enough. So we have sort of Finn McCool's sort of main powers. He has the thumb of knowledge. He can put his thumb in his mouth. He can acquire whatever knowledge he desires. He has his oxter bag. He can pull whatever he desires out of it. And he also has 2 hounds. I couldn't find a story about how he comes up with the hounds, but one of the hounds is one that we talk about in sometimes on our tours at the Giant's Causeway. We have Bran, which roughly translates as raven, and then we have Skolang, which means survivor. And now these 2 Irish wolfhounds were said to be humans first, that were enchanted by a druid to be turned into Irish wolfhounds. There's not really a whole lot I could find on how exactly that happened, but these are also 2 figures associated with Finn, that he has these Irish wolfhounds. Which
comes to a certain point where you just go, yeah, that sounds like
yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Yes. Well, it was with this thumb of knowledge that Finn, how he comes to lead the Fianna is he puts the thumb in his mouth, finds some remnants of what's left of the Fianna. He announces his cool son. He shows them his oxter bag, and they say, we want you to be our leader. Now, this is what this story is sort of the making of Finn McCool. They go to the High King to make Finn McCool their leader. They arrive at the High King on Samhain Eve, on Halloween Eve. And the High King tells these chaps, the Fianna, that every Samhain Eve there's a fairy which comes, a member of the Tuatha De Danann comes from underneath the fairy mound. His name is Ailinn, and he comes and he lulls all the people of Tara, that's the sort of capital of Ireland at the time. He lulls the people of Tara to sleep with his song, and then he comes and he steals everything from the High King's house and he burns the city of Tara down. This happens every Halloween Eve for the last 23 years. Finn McCool immediately volunteers to fight Ailinn. So to avoid going to sleep, he places a spear between his head and the ground, so every time he lulls off, his head hits the spear. So he stays awake, everybody else falls asleep. He goes out to fight Ailinn, and he cuts Ailinn's head off, and he becomes then champion of the Fianna. So then he leads the Fianna. Gull MacMurna gives up his leadership, gives it to him, and Finn then comes up with the rules for joining the Fianna. So if you want to join the Fianna, Anybody here? This is what you have to be able to do. He must be versed in the 12 books of poetry, must himself be skilled to make verse in the rhyme and metre of the masters of Gaelic poetry. Then he was buried to his middle in the earth, and must, with a shield and a hazel stick, there defend himself against 9 warriors, casting spears at him, and if he were wounded, he was not accepted. Then his hair was woven into a braid, and he was chased through the forest by the FIONN. If he were overtaken, or if a braid of his hair were disturbed, or if a dry stick cracked under his foot, he was not accepted. He must be able to leap over a lath level with his brow, and to run at full speed under one level with his knee, and he must be able, while running, to draw out a thorn from his foot and never slacken speed. He must take no dowry with a wife.
I know, I understand the buried and defend yourself, and the being chased and not being able to have any part of you caught, and the leaping and running and the taking thorns out of your feet on the run. But the verse, that is the most Irish thing I have ever heard. Because you think about Ireland, you think about sitting in a wee pub somewhere in the middle of County Wicklow, and some man at the fire telling stories or singing songs.
Yeah.
And that is a very Irish thing, that we're not ashamed of telling stories, we're not ashamed of poetry or song.
It's one of the things that's sometimes said about Ireland, a nation of storytellers, which is yes, it's one of the things I do like about these old stories. It's you might be able to beat me in a fight, but could you recite?
Could you rap?
Yeah, could you? Yeah,
but I mean,
which is probably in some ways it could be how they sort of saw it back then. Maybe I don't. You do sort of have a good spell in Irish history. Which we do have record of, called, sorry to go off on tangent, the Contention of the Bards, which I think was in the 1600s, which is where a lot of the bards in Ireland started writing poetry against each other, which is
that is yeah.
It's sometimes seen as when the bards sort of fell out of sort of faded into obscurity after that. I've read some of it. Some of it sort of doesn't make any sense to the modern listener. But it is hilarious.
1600s, you're talking about Shakespeare's time, and a lot of that doesn't make sense.
It's a lot of bards talking about your cows produce sour milk and your women are ugly. It's that type of thing, It's
mad jokes.
Yeah, basically. Because these bards would have worked for a king, and it's one petty king or another petty king, and it's like,
But it's that view of manlyhood is not just being able to fight, but to be able to look after yourself and string a verse together.
Yeah, it was sort of seen in sort of ancient Gaelic society too, as if these Fili are so well respected, these bards are so well respected, because it was seen as a great shame if a bard were inclined to write a satire of you. That was seen as a great dishonour to have a bard write a satire of you.
By a bard.
Yeah, so it was seen when you had travelling bards, you gave them the highest of hospitality at all times.
Wow. So when Finn had these qualifications for being one of the FIONN.
Yes. Well, that's interesting about Finn was it was more do as I say, not as I do, particularly in regards to the last thing I said there. He must take no dowry with a wife. Finn McCool is associated with a few different women. One of them we talk about in our tales is Una, who is not mentioned in the mythology at all, which is interesting. So she's not mentioned in the mythology at all. One of his wives, which I will talk about, a lady called Scythe. Scythe was a lady who was enchanted by a druid to be turned into a deer because she refused the druid's advances. Somebody told this lady deer to go and essentially seek out Finn McCool, that Finn McCool could help her. So Scythe searched for Finn McCool and found him when he was out hunting. Finn McCool noticed after he'd seen this deer that his 2 dogs, Bran and Scoiling, wouldn't attack the deer because they recognised the deer as being an animal a human, an animal form just like they were. Finn takes this deer back to his house where she transforms into a beautiful woman. He marries her. He
just was this after the pub's closed?
Yeah.
We've all been there.
He marries her. He has a child with her, Oisín, and
so Oisín was Scythe's.
Yes, and Oisín, very, very important figure. Quite a few tales about Oisín. What I should say is Scythe gets pregnant, or she becomes pregnant. She becomes pregnant with Finn's child, However, when Finn goes off fighting somewhere else, the druid comes back, and the druid creates a false image of Finn outside her house, and she goes out thinking it's her husband, and instead finds this evil druid. The druid, with a hit of his magic wand made of hazel, turns her back into a deer, and she runs off and is never seen again. Finn searches for her for 7 years, and at the end of those 7 years he finds a young child living out wild in the woods, and he recognises the features of this child from his wife Sive, and becomes his son Oisín. Now Oisín, by the way, roughly translates as young deer. Young deer. So that's how we get Oisín. Again, we could go on and on. There's loads and loads of these tales about Finn McCool, and not just about Finn McCool, about his Fianna, about the sort of band of warriors get mentioned quite a bit. You have Diarmid. Diarmid has a spot on his head called a love spot, and it said that if any woman were to see his love spot, they would instantly fall in love with him. You have Quilta. Quilta is a chap who can run as fast as run like the wind, just like Forrest Gump, and he can. There's one story where he's requested by a high king. The high king wants all the animals of Ireland brought to his palace. Or brought to his castle. He gets Quilta to do it, and Quilta does it. He brings all the animals of Ireland to the king's house, and he can run up and down. And then one of my favourite fellas, Conan gets hurt by a druid's spell, and he loses all the skin off his back. So to save him, Finn and the Fianna attach the skin of a sheep to his back, which it said it would keep him warm in the winter.
Fair enough.
Of all the superpowers, I don't think I would like that. That's probably the worst. But Oisín, where this sort of links back in when we're talking about Christianization, is Oisín and Tír na nÓg, another very, very famous tale from Irish mythology. Essentially, when Oisín, in his later life, when Finn McCool is an older man, Oisín gets visited by a fairy woman, a lady from Tír na nÓg called Niamh. Niamh thinks Oisín is this great poet, and she would like to take him back to Tír na nÓg and marry him, and he's instantly in love with this beautiful fairy woman. So he goes back to Tír na nÓg. Tír na nÓg now means the land of youth, sometimes called the land of eternal youth, seen as sort of to the early people of Ireland the equivalent of their heaven, otherworld or afterlife.
Valhalla.
Yes, that type of thing. So Oisín goes to Tír na nÓg, marries Niamh. He spends 3 years with her. They have 3 children, and after 3 years, Oisín, his heart aches to go back home to see his father. But Niamh warns him that time passes differently in Tír na nÓg. 3 years in Tír na nÓg has meant 300 years back in the overworld, back home. So she says to him, if you go back, you'll have to go on this horse. And this horse will keep you up off the ground, because if you're to touch the ground, you will age all those 300 years in an instant. Oisín goes back to Ireland, and he finds all his friends are gone. His father Finn's house is overgrown with weeds. He talks to people, nobody's heard of Finn McCool. And then what happens is he decides he'll go back to Tír na nÓg, but on his way back he helps some chaps lift a big stone, because he's that kind of man, is what it says in the mythology. He's the type of man who, if you're trying to lift a heavy stone, he will come and help you. So he goes and tries to lift these stones with these fellow, but as he's doing that, the saddle on his horse breaks. He lands on the ground. He instantly ages 300 years and becomes an old man. His hair turns white, his teeth fall out, and the people decide, we know just the man to take him to, St. Patrick. So they take him to St. Patrick, and Oisín tells St. Patrick all the tales of the Fianna. That's sort of the angle of where these tales come from. You're to think that they're, as we're telling these tales, it's meant to be as Oisín is describing them to St. Patrick. So St. Patrick writes all these stories down. He says, well, Oisín, you're a pagan. I can do for you before you die is I can convert you to Christianity. And there's a few different versions of this. In one version, Oisín says, well, where is my father Finn? And St. Patrick says, well, Finn was a pagan, so he's in hell. And Oisín says, well, I would rather be in hell with my father than go to a heaven that wouldn't accept him. Mm-hmm. In other stories, Oisín converts to Christianity. It's interesting is that story survived about him rejecting Christianity, which is it's very interesting how that survived. In other versions, he converts to Christianity. In other versions, the Tír na nÓg story didn't happen. Oisín lives long enough to meet St. Patrick, and he lives long enough with another fella from the Fianna, Quilta, the one I was talking about earlier, the guy who runs very, very fast. And this is a tale told in an old manuscript called The Tales of the Elders of Ireland. And it's essentially Oisin and Cuilta, they're the last surviving members of the FIONN, and that's exactly the same time when St. Patrick comes. They're old men. The FIONN are gone now. They're the last two, and the sort of whole thing is they sort of bring St. Patrick, they regale him of tales of the FIONN, tales of Ireland, tales of their ancestors. They tell him how it's also Lord of Places. They bring St. Patrick all around Ireland and tell him how each town got its name and everything like that. And it's seen by a lot of people as sort of the torch passing from the old pagans to the Christians. It's sort of the last heroes of the pagan era, Oisin and Cuilta, passing over then to St. Patrick, and then are sort of how a lot of those Christian scribes wanted it to be, because these stories, while we laugh at them now, were taken very, very seriously by people, and they were back then, and they were sort of seen as, well, this is our history. They didn't see them as myths and legends. They seen them a lot of times. We know they've seen them as history, and it was very important, I suppose, to those Christian scribes to sort of envisage this sort of passing on then from our last heroes from that era, Oisin and Cuilta, passing on then to St. Patrick, and then the rest is history from there. So I hope I answered your question. Who was Finn McCool in a roundabout way?
But that is fantastic. Honestly, when I approached Jimbo about this, he came to me about a week ago and he said, how long will it be? Because I've got about 6 hours worth of material. You don't know how much of this I've cut onto the floor, but I am pretty sure he could come back and talk a whole lot more about Irish mythology. If it's something you'd like, let me know. I will certainly get Jimbo around to do that, or even encourage him to actually write something down, because he does like to write the odd piece, the odd time. Thank you very much for all that. Now, if we have listeners who have got the bug for Irish mythology, where can they go?
My first thing, because I would imagine if they're listening to your podcast, they like listening to podcasts.
Well, not necessarily listening to this, but yes.
My favourite is the Irish Mythology Podcast. So they adapt and retell a lot of tales from Irish mythology. So I would highly recommend that to people. Another one, if you're interested in stories about Finn McCool and you want something sort of easier to digest, you can listen to an audio album by a chap called Edmund Lenihan, who we were talking about. Fela and storytellers. He's said to be carrying on. He's what's called a shanachie, or a bearer of old lore, an old storyteller, and he sort of has carried some of these Finn McCool's tales forward and sort of a bit more sort of PG way. Finn McCool and the PUCA and the Dark Pool is what you could search on Spotify. And there's a book called Gods and Fighting Men, which it's a favourite of mine for sort of, it was written in 1904. It has a lot of tales of Irish mythology, and one I would recommend to anybody. We were talking about the Tain Bocúilne. There is a translation of it done by a chap called Thomas Kinsella in 1969. So as I said, we were talking about that. It was sort of Ireland's answer to the Iliad. Yes, so it's called the Tain by Thomas Kinsella.
Well, what I'm going to do is put this in the descriptions below, so you will get this information in whatever medium that you would like to listen to this to, because I have actually just converted most things onto YouTube. So this will go out on YouTube as well, because a lot of people said, is it on YouTube? It's not. It is now. Most of it all, whether you like it or not. Folks, if you've enjoyed Irish mythology, and I actually really enjoyed that, I didn't realise how far back Finn McCool. Do you actually think, Jimbo, that Finn McCool was a real person?
That's a great question. It was something that was pondered by people in the 17th and 18th centuries. It was so because from what we can sort of ascertain, Finn McCool is traditionally said to have taken a place. The FIONN cycle is said to traditionally take place sort of right before St. Patrick comes. So we're
500s before the 500s. So
sort of 300-400 AD. Figure we certainly know that the FIONN were more than likely real. Whether they had sheepskin on their back, we don't know. But it was hypothesized maybe in the 17th, 18th century by some scholars that he could have been a story, and the stories, or he could have been this great warrior, but the stories maybe got a bit out of hand. Maybe he's an amalgamation of all tales of the Fianna, which I'm sure the real life Fianna would have had plenty of riveting stories, which we would all love to hear if we could. It's amazing we have what we have. We circle back to the story that we tell, and it's what happens over the years. Stories get bits added onto them; they have bits taken away, and I'm
actually quite shocked. I'm sitting here. I really didn't learn much about Irish mythology when I was a child.
Yeah.
But how rich it is. I would say no movies about it, no comic books about it, no.
I know, yeah. I know there was a time when I believe Michael Fassbender was going to make a Cuchulainn film, but it never materialized. Essentially, out of all of them, I would love to see a Cuchulainn film, a sort of adaptation of the Tain. Well, in some ways, a lot of people, you might say that it's difficult to sort of get into a narrative, but I'm sure you could probably do it. The closest thing, although they've mainly adapted the mythological cycle so far, is that Irish Mythology Podcast. They're great at sort of adapting and sort of bringing the dialogue up to scratch and bringing the prose up, and they sort of act it out. And the sound effects and music and things, and that's as close as you can get, and they do a fantastic job of that, I have to say. But yes, no, you're exactly right. Certainly we see it in literature a few times. People take a lot from Irish mythology, but it's certainly not as famous as your Norse mythology. No. I would imagine actually most people would probably be more familiar with Norse mythology or Greek or Roman mythology. I could be wrong, but I would imagine I'm probably not.
Could well be.
But one thing I would say on that subject is these stories that belong to all of us who live here. I would definitely tell people to not let that put you off if you wanted to get sort of sucked into it as I have. What I would say a good starting point for all this is Wikipedia. Just to put that in there, because I forgot. Wikipedia is actually great, has a lot of stuff on this, and it's probably the best thing for sort of getting in and sort of visualizing where you want to jump in at.
Right.
Yeah.
But that's amazing. Listen, thank you so much for this. That has been so helpful for me. I've been taking notes as you were writing or as you were talking. Guys, if you want to contact me about Irish mythology and you know how to do that, email at mymarksmess@gmail.com, on Twitter at Marksmess Podcasts, or on, we don't actually use the blog spot, the marksmesspodcast.blogspot.com, but you can get me on Facebook at Marksmess Podcast. Let me know what you think of this. This has been Marksmess Podcast, episode 64. And thanks to Josh Woodward of joshwoodward.com for the title music. And thank to you, Jimbo, for coming along. Scooby has absolutely enjoyed this. He was sitting beside Jimbo, listening to every single word as he snored. We will actually continue with talking to people at work next time, because next time we're actually going to look at a more modern mythology. We're going to talk about somebody who has actually written a fantasy novel. I have read it and I want to talk to him about it on the podcast. So come back next time and we'll have that. Thank you for listening, and come back again for our next episode. Bye.
Thank you very much for having me, Mark. Bye.
They came from the sky in great dark clouds, landed on the mountains of Connemara, and they brought a shadow over the sun, and it lasted 3 days and 3 nights. Ireland will never be the same.
This summer, join us for the coming of the gods and the last stand of the warriors who opposed them.
Be there for the great bloody battles and terrifying acts of dark sorcery.
Witness the awe-inspiring bravery of the Firbolg and the unstoppable power of the Tuatha.
Not just gods and fighting men,
but gods fighting men. Coming soon on the Irish Mythology Podcast.
So, what's our plan?
Well, I was thinking, first we shrink and steal the moon with the help of our wee friends.
Yeah, because then we can use our neuralizer to erase everyone's memory.
Aye, and we can use those meddling kids and their dog.
And we can uncover that the chicken was actually a penguin with a rubber glove all along.
Right, back to the plan to take over the world.